So here's a story. I like go into a time machine, press a button, and then I die. The time machine blows up or disappears. And then later, just like by a stroke of luck, a machine pops into existence with like a clone of me. And the clone of me says like, I was David Builes, I've time traveled, etc. You might think that's not really time travel. That's just like someone died and then someone popped into existence by a freak accident and had the same memories and personality. So that sort of looks the same on the outside. But we don't want to say that's time travel. And so genuine time travel, it seems like, requires a kind of notion of identity, like the person who stepped out is the very same person who stepped in, and a sort of causal connection that like, it was because I pressed this button that caused this thing. Both can be resisted. So I think it certainly seems possible that I just like, I don't know, pop out of existence and some other thing pops into existence. But the sort of identity thing and the causal thing, I think, are much more suspect.
We have a lot of the same interests, I've noticed. Physics, math, philosophy, naturally. And you worked on a lot of really interesting topics. And before we get into those topics and some of those papers you've written, I was curious how you got into math, philosophy, science sort of thing in the first place.
Cool. Yeah. So I actually got into philosophy via religion. So I grew up in a Catholic background, went to Catholic schools, and I guess around like my early teenage years, I discovered philosophy of religion, all these arguments for and against the existence of God and whatnot. And I think philosophy of religion itself is sort of connected with so many different areas of philosophy. So obviously with metaphysics, but also philosophy of mind, like are we non-physical things that survive our death? And epistemology, how do we rationally form beliefs about all these matters? So I got into philosophy, I think, via philosophy of religion. And ever since then, I've been really interested in all the kinds of questions philosophers ask and the methodology they have. And so ever since then, I've been into philosophy. I guess one other route I had into philosophy is I used to think of myself more as a math person before I did philosophy. And I discovered philosophy and I discovered this intersection of philosophy of math. And so in undergrad, actually part of me wanted to like become a logician and a set theorist. So I was really interested in set theory. In particular, there's a lot of philosophically inspired questions in the foundations of math and set theory. So part of me wanted to actually go into becoming a set theorist, but eventually I did not do that, and I ended up doing philosophy. And I've dabbled in philosophy of math a bit. I feel like it's not my main thing I've been working on, but I've been happy to do some stuff there.
Yeah, there's a lot more overlap there than I had even expected. I also grew up in a religious household. I grew up pretty much Lutheran, but I also went to Catholic school.
Okay, cool.
And I found that I didn't believe in God at a very young age.
Okay.
And I wonder if being in this environment where I was forced to ask very difficult questions and everybody was telling me things I didn't believe, it might have pushed me in a philosophical direction.
Yeah, I totally, I definitely was a genuine believer myself, but I did, when I discovered philosophy, I felt sort of really out of my depth in the sense that I started out with these firm convictions about all these topics. Then I realized there's all these super smart people who thought about this way more than me, who are very torn about these topics and have all these different kinds of positions. And then knowing about all these people are like, very much lessened my own confidence in my positions because I obviously knew much less about this topic back then. So yeah.
Our mutual friend, Joe Schmidt, also at Princeton, one of your students, who has a great YouTube channel, to our listeners, Majesty of Reason. I know that he works a lot in philosophy of religion. Why was it, though, that you ended up gravitating specifically towards, I guess it makes sense that you got into math because you were a math person, but why didn't philosophy of religion ever? Yeah,
that's really interesting. Yeah, so the math thing was just like for independent reasons. I was really into math and still am really, I think math is really cool and beautiful and stuff. But it's an interesting question why I haven't really worked specifically on philosophy of religion. But I guess some of my recent work is sort of tangentially related. So, because I feel like my religious views have gone sort of full circle. So I started out a very committed theist and then became kind of radical sort of agnostic, like I had no clue. But nowadays I like views that are sort of in the vicinity of theism, where there's some sense in which there's a mind at the foundation of everything, which is sort of in the vicinity of theism. But yeah, I guess I'm not really sure. I guess I just found myself having more to say about more sort of, I guess, core metaphysical kinds of issues. But yeah, I'm very much open to doing more in philosophy of religion in the future.
Yeah, I'd like to get back to that later, but when you say you're interested in these ideas where there's like a mind at the foundation of things, are you referring to your views on idealism and panpsychism, that sort of thing?
Yep.
Okay, cool. That's been flagged. We'll get back to that and maybe see how it connects a bit to religion.
Yeah.
But I'd really like to start with your work on time, because I have done a few episodes on time, not recently, but I think they've been largely from a physics perspective, and I know that your work has dovetailed with some of the physics of time, but quite generally, before we get started, what are some of the debates about time within philosophy that you find interesting?
Yeah, so there's lots of debates about time. I guess probably the most central one, which has a lot of ramifications for other debates, is I think the debate you've talked about in previous episodes between the so-called A theory of time and the B theory of time. So there's different ways to introduce this kind of debate. I actually kind of like introducing it via a kind of detour, if you don't mind.
Yeah, please.
So first, let's start with philosophical debates about the nature of possibility and necessity, so modality, because actually debates in time are very analogous in interesting ways, and I think those analogies are relevant. So in debates about modality, so it's the study of what's possible and what's necessary. So we think among the things that are true, some of them didn't have to be true, like that I wore a blue shirt, I could have worn a different colored shirt, but we think some of them had to be true. And so philosophers start talking about possible worlds when this issue comes up. So there's different sort of maximally specific ways things could have been, and those are possible worlds. And so there's one philosophical view that's very much a minority niche view where it says all possible worlds are concretely existing and on a par. That's
David Lewis.
The modal realist kind of view, a very niche view. And that view says, look, there are modal statements, like there could have been flying pigs, and those are made true by like concretely existing flesh and blood flying pigs out there.
They're just not spatio-temporally connected to our world.
Yes. So that's a very radical kind of view. The more normal view, and also that view has a kind of indexical conception of the actual world. They think by the actual world, we just mean the world we happen to inhabit. By contrast, the sort of more popular view is that there's only the actual world. Even though there are statements about what could have been, and there are these facts, but they're not made true by like concretely existing stuff out there. So that's the sort of standard view that most people have. And basically the exact same debate you can do in the metaphysics of time. So question, are all times equally on a par concretely existing stuff? Some people say yes, all times, past, present, future are on a par. There's nothing special about the present. They're all concretely existing flesh and blood things. And then statements about the past and the future are made true by these concretely existing stuff. So the fact that there were dinosaurs is made true by concrete flesh and blood dinosaurs in some other region of this four-dimensional block. But then there's this other view that says no, and also that view has a kind of indexical conception of the present. By the present moment, we just mean the moment we happen to be located in. And then there's the presentist view that says, no, time is not like that. Time is sort of like modality in the sense that only the present is real, just like only the actual stuff is real. And there are facts about the past and the future. There are facts about what did happen and what will happen. But these facts shouldn't be understood in this sort of in terms of concrete flesh and blood kind of things. Just like in the modality case, most people think it's true that there could have been flying pigs. That doesn't mean that there's concrete flesh and blood flying pigs. Similarly, it's true that there were dinosaurs. That doesn't mean that they're concrete flesh and blood dinosaurs. So that's a major difference in the metaphysics of time. There's lots of other debates I could introduce.
I mean, one disanalogy is that we are not spatio-temporally connected to these other possible worlds, but we are presumably temporally connected to these other instances of time.
Yeah, that's certainly true. Yeah. That's certainly a disanalogy. Yeah.
Okay. And one thing that you didn't mention is how necessity is cashed out in terms of possible worlds.
Yeah. Yeah. So possibility is something's possibly the case just in case there is at least one possible world where that's the case. And necessity is something it's necessary just in case it's true in all the possible worlds. So
is there a connection to the time there too?
In time case, you can say like it was always the case that such and such, and that's like it's true at all the times. Or you can say it's sometimes the case that, which means there's only one time. And so, because these analogies go pretty deep, so if you study like modal logic and temporal, there's something called temporal logic, which is actually fairly similar. You know, there's these temporal operators, modal operators, and they're understood in terms of possible worlds in the one case and times in the other case. So yeah, there's a pretty close connection there as well.
Cool. And just a couple of other things, because I think our listeners are probably interested in getting some of the philosophical vocabulary down.
Sure.
You used a term indexicality a couple of times. It comes up in lots of areas of philosophy. How do you think about just what it means?
Yeah, so indexical statements, I guess, are like context-sensitive statements that depend on like who's speaking of it. So when I say I refer to David. When you say I, you refer to Robinson. And these indexical things aren't supposed to be anything like metaphysically special. So for example, there's an indexical here, which is where I happen to be at. Different speakers will refer to different places by here. But most people don't think there's anything metaphysically special about here. So it's a kind of deflationary understanding of the relevant concept. But for example, the presentist doesn't understand the present merely as indexical, because they could just say the present time is the one that exists. So there's this non-indexical characterization of the present time, like the one that exists and the other ones don't. So that one doesn't depend on who's speaking or anything like that. Cool. Yeah. So the A theory is a kind of umbrella term for any view that in some sense takes the present time to be special. And so presentism is probably the most popular version, but there's other versions out there. The B theory goes with this kind of a block universe picture where all times are equally real and concrete.
So what are some of those other debates that are going on
so
that you
there's
find
lots of
interesting?
other, there's debates about how things persist across time. So the main choice point here is, I guess, a view called endurantism. And then there's a family of other views, but maybe the most common is perdurantism. So how do things persist across time? We normally think that lots of things do persist across time, like my water bottle will exist tomorrow and existed yesterday. So how does it manage to do that? The endurantist thinks my water bottle is a three-dimensional thing, and it exists at multiple different times by the whole thing existing at multiple different times. It doesn't exist at multiple times merely by having proper parts of it at different times. And the other view says, like, my water bottle is a four-dimensional worm, and it persists across time by having different parts at different times. So just to take a simple example, so imagine a world with like a single particle going in a straight line. So the endurantist will think there's only one thing that exists, a particle, and it's going in a straight line. And the perdurantist will think, actually, there's sort of infinitely many different particle slices that exist that are distinct from one another, and there's this like particle worm that's composed of these distinct particle slices. And so the endurantist says just there's a single particle moving in a straight line, and the perdurantist says there's infinitely many distinct ones. So that's one kind of debate. And it actually has some interesting connections with the presentism, eternalism debate. So in particular, there's a lot of people have thought there's a kind of tension between the eternalist view that all times are equally real and concrete, and the endurantist view that things persist by being sort of wholly present at each time, not by having temporal parts. And that's because if you think of the spatial case, it's very weird to think like something could exist at two spatial locations, not by part of it being here and part of it being there, but just like the whole thing is over here and also the whole thing is over there at the same time. That seems very strange. I mean, some philosophers think there are such things like universals or maybe certain kind of time travel or something. But in any case, it seems very strange that there's a single object at two places at once. And if you're a presentist, you don't have these weird like existing at multiple places at once because there's only the present time. The past and future aren't concretely existing stuff. But if you're an eternalist, you think there's this whole four-dimensional block, and there's this thing that exists completely at one region of the block and completely at another region of the block, and not by having different parts at different parts of the block. And there's a word that this involves like kind of contradiction. So imagine, this is the so-called problem of temporary intrinsics that people talk about. So imagine a banana that goes from yellow to green. On the temporal parts way of thinking of, there's just like a part of the banana that's yellow and a part of it that's green, no problem. But if you think like it's the very same banana, it's not parts of it, like the whole banana is yellow and the whole banana is green, then it almost seems like a contradiction. And so there's worries about that. So anyway, I think maybe one natural thing for the presentist to have is a kind of endurantist conception, and maybe one natural thing for the block universe person to have is a kind of sort of slices view. And yeah, I think there's a lot of other downstream consequences of whether you want to be an endurantist and perdurantist that are all really interesting, but maybe take a bit of time to explore. But anyway, those are, I guess, two views about time.
I've talked to, as you know, David Albert, Tim Mondlin, these people on the issue. I've also talked to Lee Smolin a bit about time, and he identifies himself as a very radical presentist. So there are radical presentists in the physics community. I take it, though, are you a presentist?
I think I guess my evolution on this topic is I used to have this sort of normal view that B-theoretic eternalism was like the scientifically respectable view. So I sort of used to have that view. But there was like a day where I sort of saw the light. I sort of saw the motivations behind presentism, and now I think it's much more defensible. I'm not sure if I'm committed to it at the end of the day, but I just think it's much more defensible than a lot of people take it credit for.
I think you've published an empirical argument in favor of presentism. What does that go like? So this is a co-written paper by a friend of mine, Michele and I. And within this debate between presentists and eternalists, oftentimes presentists are on the defensive, especially with respect to physics, because this sort of standard thing to say is like relativity seems to go against presentism, because presentism seems to presuppose there's a kind of absolute simultaneity, but relativity seems to suggest otherwise. So that's a sort of standard argument that people talk about. But it's interesting to see, are there any scientific reasons in favor of presentism? And that would be interesting. And so, we have this paper where we try to argue that there are scientific reasons in favor of presentism. And I guess the main way the paper goes is that there's a certain aspect of the laws of physics that we think are predicted if you're a presentist, that if you're a certain kind of presentist, the laws of physics have to be that way. But if you're a block universe person, it's sort of just a kind of a random coincidence that the laws are that way, and there's no real explanation for why the laws are that way. And so the certain aspect of the laws of physics that we focus on is that the laws of physics are Markovian. And that's a technical term that basically means that the present state of the universe sort of screens off anything that might have happened in the past. So that the past can only causally affect what happened in the future by way of the present. It can't sort of directly influence the future in a way that sort of skips over the present. And it's sort of easy to imagine possible worlds where there are non-Markovian laws. So in the paper, we give a sort of very toy example. So imagine the world is just a sequence of ones and zeros. That's sort of the world. Here's a sequence of ones and zeros, 1, 1, 0, 0, 1, 1, 0, 0, 1, 1, 0, 0. So that's a non-Markovian world in the sense that if you take the present time just to be 1, then to know what will happen in the future, you have to look into the past. You can't just look at the present. So if you're at a 1, to know whether the next state will be 0 or 1, you have to look into the past. So it's very easy to imagine non-Markovian laws. And in the paper, we go through a lot of different ways the sort of block universe person might try to explain why the laws have to be that way. And we conclude that there really is no reason why the laws should have to be that way. But I think if you're a presentist, there's a very natural explanation for why sort of the present screens off the past and the past can't influence the future in a way that sort of skips over the present. And the obvious idea is just that all there is the present state. There's the present state sort of, exhausts all of concrete reality. And so if you have this view that, look, the only causal constraints on what will happen have to be grounded in like concretely existing stuff. So only concretely existing stuff can actually put any causal constraints on what will happen in the future. Then you sort of immediately get that, you only have to look to the present and you don't have to look at these past truths. So we think there's a certain aspect of the laws of physics that's just a kind of inexplicable coincidence. If you're a block universe person, we could very easily imagine laws that are not that way. But if you're a presentist, we think there's principal reasons for thinking the laws had to be that way. So it's a kind of empirical prediction of presentism that the laws have to be Markovian. And so if, tomorrow physicists announce the laws are not Markovian, I think that would just like refute presentism and be an argument for the block universe view. I think currently, there are certain sort of unorthodox physical theories that are not Markovian, but my understanding is that if you just look at quantum field theory, Schrodinger equation, these kinds of things, they are standardly interpreted as Markovian kinds of laws. Is a reasonable, and correct me if I'm totally off base here, paraphrase of the gist of this argument, that reality corresponds to causal efficacy or something like that. And if the past has and can causally influence the future without touching the present, then we ought to claim it's real.
Yeah, something like that. So, this gets into what do you think about the laws of nature and the nature of causation and stuff. But I think a very natural kind of view to have is that causal constraints in the future have to be grounded in concretely existing stuff. And that on its own doesn't say anything if you're a block universe person, because everything concretely exists. But if you're a presentist, it puts a lot of constraints on how the future might go.
I think I had a somewhat, well, for me, it was a frustrating conversation with Tim about this, mainly because I lack the knowledge of physics to really be persuasive or get my point across when I'm talking with him. But I think it came down to Markovian laws. I was asking about whether or not time travel to the future is possible, in which would bypass the person at a certain point, and he was insisting that time travel to the future is possible. You just cryogenically freeze yourself and then go through the present. But I'm wondering if you can bypass
present. I think that's actually another. So before, when you talked about interesting debates about time, obviously another debate is time travel, and there's actually a lot of interesting stuff about the relationship between time travel and this kind of A theory, B theory kind of thing. So some people argue that there's specific reasons internal to like the A theory of time why time travel doesn't really make sense. But maybe it makes more sense on a kind of B theoretic picture. But anyway, but about the time travel to the future, I guess is the question whether it's possible or so there's a question whether like the laws of physics allow it and stuff, and there's a sort of question about it whether it's compatible with like the nature of time and stuff. I think time travel is kind of a weird thing because there's a lot of things that seem like time travel, but you have to distinguish, and it's actually hard to distinguish that. So here's a story. I like go into a time machine, press a button, and then I die. The time machine blows up or disappears. And then later, just like by a stroke of luck, a machine pops into existence with like a clone of me. And the clone of me says like, I was David Builes, I've time traveled, etc. But you might think that's not really time travel. That's just like someone died and then someone popped into existence by a freak accident and had the same memories and personality. So, and actually like that sort of looks the same on the outside. But we don't want to say that's time travel. And so genuine time travel, it seems like, requires a kind of notion of identity, like the person who stepped out is the very same person who stepped in, and a sort of causal connection that like it was because I pressed this button that caused this thing. And I think both can be resisted. So I think it certainly seems possible that I just like, I don't know, pop out of existence and some other thing pops into existence. But the sort of identity thing and the causal thing, I think, are much more suspect.
This is more of a meta question or comment, but in one of my conversations with Dan Dennett, he mentioned that he really hates these swamp man sort of thought experiments where people just pop into existence out of nowhere, because if I recall correctly, they're just not so useful as intuition pumps because they're so far from our intuitions. We really don't know what to think about them, but they are very fun.
Yeah, I think they're really fun, and I think they're very, I think it depends on your purpose, whether they're useful. So you might just want to kind of, there might be certain theoretical purposes for which it's irrelevant to think about swamp. But I think, metaphysicians often want to have like very general theories about like what's possible and et cetera, and they want to cover like all the cases. So I think for metaphysicians, I think it's very natural to consider these very weird kinds of cases. And I think often a lot of the most interesting metaphysics comes from considering very weird kinds of cases. So yeah, I guess it depends on your theoretical purposes, but I find myself thinking about that kind of stuff a lot.
One last question I have about time. You mentioned that the present exists if you're a presentist, and the past and the future don't. Yeah. And this raises the question just how long the present is. And I imagine that this is a question that is much easier to answer if you're on some level convinced of the idea that space and time are like a lattice at the core and they're discrete.
Yeah.
Whereas if you think time and space are continuous, this might be more difficult to answer.
Yeah. I think if you think there's something like the Planck time and there's some kind of finite duration, then I think, but maybe the natural thing for the presentist to say is that, I don't know, it's the Planck length or something. But I guess the natural thing to say in the continuous case is just that it's wrong to think of the present as temporally extended at all. There's just, the world's extended in spatial dimensions, but it's wrong to think of time as a kind of dimension across which things are extended. And that's probably compatible with the stuff changes all the time, and I was a certain way in the past and I will be that way in the future. But I think the presentist should say, you shouldn't think of time as the sort of way that things are extended in a kind of concrete dimension.
Well, since we were talking about the laws of nature and Markovian laws, maybe a natural or shoehorn, maybe it's just a shoehorn segue, is into some of your work on panpsychism and idealism. And I think it might start with, or something that might be helpful to start with, is an explanation of the distinction between Humean and non-Humean laws.
Yeah, great. So people draw this distinction in different ways. I think of, so humanism takes a very deflationary take on both causation and law. So they think really at the fundamental level, there is no causation and there is no laws. There are these sort of more deflated, non-fundamental concepts that we can define up, where basically the Humean conception of laws are just kind of simple, informative summaries of stuff that happens. They don't push and pull stuff around or anything. They're just sort of summaries of what happens. And the non-Humean actually has a lot of different, the non-Humean it's a big camp. They all reject the Humean picture. They think that there's some kind of fundamental ingredient that sort of pushes and pulls things around and sort of explains why the world evolves the way that it does, but they differ over what their sort of ingredient is. There is a kind of non-Humean view that takes laws as the centerpiece, or posits laws as these sort of primitive entities or something like that. There's different conceptions of that view, and then the view is that there are these primitive laws, and these primitive laws explain why things evolve. That's not the only non-Humean view, so you could basically distinguish a sort of more external non-Humean view from a sort of internal non-Humean view. So there's a sort of external governing picture where there's things coming in from the outside that sort of tell things where to go. And there's a more sort of internal picture where, no, there's nothing sort of from the outside that tells things where to go. It's just things do what they do because of the nature that they have. So massive things are different than electrically charged things, and it's because they have the nature that they do, that they behave in the way that they do, but there isn't some kind of external governing kind of picture. And on that sort of internal kind of picture, you might also think of laws as just sort of summarizing things. It's not really doing much. But on the sort of external governing picture, they push things around more.
Okay, so the Humean views laws as something like maybe observed regularities, patterns, things like that.
Yeah.
And then the non-Humean thinks of them as much more robustly metaphysical, whether it's coming from the outside, God imposing laws on the world, or, as you said, based on the nature of things. Strings do what they do because it's just
kinds of things
nature,
that they are.
if they exist.
Yeah.
If strings exist.
Yeah.
Okay. And where does this connect with consciousness?
Cool. Yeah. So there's this, tradition that some people label Russellian monism, other people label Ramseyan humility, other people label epistemic structural realism. So there's a lot of labels, but the basic thought is that really science doesn't tell us about what things are like intrinsically. Science only tells us the kinds of causal relationships that things stand in. So if you ask a scientist, what is it to have mass, or what is it to be electrically charged? They'll tell you the sort of role it has in certain mathematical equations. Like if you're electrically charged, you're going to interact with other electrically charged things in such and such ways. And if you're massive, you'll interact with massive things in such and such ways. But science actually doesn't tell us sort of the intrinsic nature of electric charge or mass. They just tell us the sort of functional thing of what it does. And I think there's actually a cool, interesting analogy between consciousness here, because take the experience of pain, let's say. There's a sort of you can draw the similar distinction of that there's a kind of the causal role of pain, sort of what pain does. And what does pain do? It makes you say ow and avoid it and things like this. But there's also you can know all about that sort of functional characterization of what pain makes you do, but you're still missing out on something. You're missing out on like the intrinsic character of what it feels like to be in pain. Something with experience of red, you can know how it interacts with the brain and whatever, but it seems like you're missing out on the intrinsic character of the experience of red. And so so a lot of people who don't have any specific views about consciousness have endorsed this view about physics, that physics only tells us sort of causal structure, and it doesn't tell us the nature of the properties that play these causal roles. And so then there's an interesting question of like, what are these intrinsic natures of the properties that play the causal roles that physics is silent about? And you could just be sort of a Mysterian and say, we'll never know, and we're just sort of blocked from that. But sort of one thing that people have speculated about, like in the literature on the philosophy of mind, is that maybe we should take this analogy pretty seriously. Like in the case of consciousness, there's what consciousness looks like from the outside, how it behaves, but there's also like this internal ingredient that you're missing. Maybe the same thing is happening for physical systems, that there's this, we know what physical systems do from the outside, but there's a sort of an internal thing that we can't publicly observe. And maybe that has something to do with consciousness. So, and people endorse the variations of panpsychism and idealism, which say, the nature of mass or electric charge or the wave function of the universe is really consciousness, and physics sort of describes it sort of from the outside of how it interacts with other things. And I think this is related to the sort of Humean, non-Humean kind of divide, because earlier I said there's this version of non-Humanism where you explain why things do what they do in terms of their sort of internal nature or something like that. And so if you think that the internal nature of things is associated with consciousness, then that view would be that it's because of things, consciousness properties, that they behave in the way that they do. And I think we have a sort of a glimpse of how this works in the case of our own conscious experience. So like if you experience a horrible pain and then you're motivated to like try to get rid of it or something, there seems like there's like an intelligible connection there between like the horribleness of the pain and why you're inclined to get rid of it. It seems like there's a kind of explanation of like the reason why you try to avoid the pain is because of how it feels. And you might think similar things happen for the microphysical level, but the reason why things do what they do is because they have this kind of conscious internal nature. And so that's a view, something that's called the phenomenal powers view, that it's been prominently defended by Hedda Merck, and I myself have defended it in a couple of places, and Harold Langzam has defended it. But I think that's a kind of view that it's a non-Humean view where you have like an explanation for why things do what they do. And I sort of like it because it's sort of, it tries to have certain Humean commitments or be compatible with certain Humean commitments. So it doesn't posit anything extra that the Humean already doesn't believe in. So the Humean already believes in these unknowable intrinsic natures, at least most versions of Humanism do. So David Lewis, the arch-Humean, believed that there were these, what he called quiddities that we can't know anything about. And this version of non-Humanism doesn't posit any like external governing laws or God to make things happen. So it doesn't posit anything the Humean doesn't. It just has a different view on those sort of things that we can't know about. And it tries to give some kind of explanatory story for how this explanation could go. Like we have a glimpse of it in our own conscious lives. So I think it's a cool connection between consciousness and this kind of non-Humean stuff.
Where specifically do panpsychism and then idealism come in?
So there's a question of defining panpsychism and idealism. And I think at least one clear difference is, obviously people define these things in many different ways, but one definition of panpsychism is just that some fundamental physical types of entities are conscious or something like that. Idealism, I think of as a stronger thesis that something like there's nothing but consciousness at the fundamental level. So the panpsychist it's compatible with panpsychism that there's other stuff in addition to consciousness at the fundamental level. And idealism just says there's nothing but consciousness. So idealism is stronger than panpsychism. And the way it comes in is just via this kind of point about physics only tells us the structural nature of things, not the intrinsic nature of things. And if you think the intrinsic nature of things involves consciousness, and if you have the stronger view that there's nothing else but consciousness, then that would be a kind of idealist picture where what physics is describing is sort of the flux of consciousness sort of from the outside. We see these patterns and mathematicize them. But sort of the underlying explanation for why things behave according to these patterns is because they have the conscious experiences that they did.
And where do you fall in here? Do you label yourself?
So obviously a lot of these things are super speculative, but I guess I'm inclined to, just on the first order evidence, actually prefer a kind of idealist picture. I've even argued for this even stronger version in another paper of mine.
Is that the one on modal idealism?
Yeah, where I think there's a question. So suppose you buy this view that a lot of people do and who are not really interested in consciousness, about there are these intrinsic natures that we don't know of. There's a question of like, what kinds of intrinsic natures could there be? Maybe some involve consciousness, but could there be some other totally different kind of intrinsic nature? And I guess I've tried to argue that actually the only possible intrinsic nature there could be is consciousness. So like idealism is not only just like a contingent truth that happens to be true, but like all possible worlds are idealist worlds, which is a very strong thesis. And obviously, because it's such a strong thesis, not at all super confident in it, but I think there's interesting arguments in favor.
I've never talked about idealism on the show. I have talked about panpsychism a few times. I interviewed Philip Goff, and then it's come up in some conversations with, I think, Dan Dennett and Sean Carroll, and maybe Steven Pinker too. And Sean and Dan are people who are very science-minded, but I think that you're very science-minded too.
Yeah.
So I wonder where it is that you find yourself disagreeing with people like them who point to the success of the NCC, or neural correlates of consciousness program, and think that, or are convinced that eventually, science hasn't reached a stumbling block yet. So why shouldn't we have faith that it will eventually unravel the hard problem, which I think.
Yeah. So actually one of my main reasons for having this kind of view is motivated by this sort of Humean, non-Humean kind of stuff. So I think there's actually just really strong arguments against Humeanism, it seems to me. There's also really strong arguments against a kind of external governing picture. So I think the only view left is some kind of internal non-Humanism. But then there's this question of like, how could we have some explanation for why this internal stuff makes things behave? And I think our sort of only glimpse of how that could be intelligible is our own conscious life. So I think even independently of like the standard arguments in the philosophy of mind, I just think there's arguments from science that we need to explain why things do what they do, and this is the most promising route. But even bracketing all that, I mean, there's all the standard sort of anti-physicalist arguments that people talk about sort of knowledge argument and the explanatory gap argument and the zombie argument, and I sort of am sympathetic to all those arguments, and it's not clear to me that the sort of neuroscientific work of like correlating certain brain activity to consciousness is a great argument for physicalism. I think any version of anti-physicalism should agree that there's all these correlations. There's just a question about the nature of these correlations. So are those like identifications or are those some other kind of connection? Is there some kind of bridging law? Are these correlations something like what consciousness does from the outside, but there's this sort of internal nature to that causal activity? So yeah, I think I think everyone should agree that obviously if you do stuff to your brain, you change your conscious experience, but it's not at all clear to me that forces anyone to be a physicalist or anything. In terms of like, will one day get there? Yeah, I guess for me, the sort of standard anti-physicalist arguments don't seem to be a sort of matter of degree, that we just need to know more complexity about how neurons behave. It seems to be a sort of fundamental difference in kind. And again, there's this motivation just in terms of understanding the laws of nature and a kind of non-Humean thing that isn't touched by these kinds of things. So, I mean, I should say that, all these are obviously super speculative, and I totally think physicalist views are totally respectable. And in some moods, I mean, I sort of am attracted to opposite extremes on this kind of picture. Part of me likes sort of idealism, that it's all consciousness. But part of me likes this kind of radical like illusionism that actually all this special consciousness stuff, it's just, it's all an illusion. There's just, brain activity in our brain is making us think we have all these special properties. So in some ways, I'm sort of attracted to this, like all consciousness is an illusion. So I'm sort of attracted to opposite extremes that it's either like everything or nothing. But I still think even if I was an illusionist, I'd have this problem of like, there's this internal nature of things and why do they behave in the way they do? And consciousness helps us with that. And I think there's independent reason to think that, the only possible intrinsic nature is consciousness. So anyway, I should say those views are perfectly respectable.
I wonder about your attitude toward philosophy more generally. Bringing Tim Maudlin into this again, he has said to me, and I'm sure he's said elsewhere, that he takes physics and philosophy of physics very, very seriously. It is not a game to him at all. Whereas for me, there are certainly some questions that I find very personally important that I get the right answer. Meta-ethical questions right now I'm very curious about. But then other questions, maybe about the philosophy of physics, for instance, I find them interesting, but it is more of a game and it's just fun. And I'm wondering how you take these debates. Is it really important to you that you get idealism
I think the answers to these questions are really important to me. I think this is a really interesting divide among philosophers that I've noticed. So I think there's some philosophers that like sort of the activity of philosophizing and they don't really care about them. They maybe somewhat care, but they didn't really get into it because they want like the final answers or anything. But there's other philosophers that, I don't know, just really are interested in specific questions, and it's like really a huge life investment in their, I don't know, it's a really big deal for them. And I sort of like giving people a certain thought experiment to bring this out. So imagine like God came down to you and said, look, at the end of your philosophical career, all your views are just going to be massively mistaken. None of what you said is going to be true. Your whole career will just have led people to falsehoods, etc. But by the way, I'm going to give you a memory loss pill that this conversation never happened. But before I give you the memory loss pill, you can decide whether you want to quit philosophy and do something else. So for the people who just like the activity of philosophizing, then who cares? I'll just keep on philosophizing. But if your whole project is like you want to get to the truth of these questions, then it seems like there's no point of doing philosophy if God told you that everything, your whole career will have been a bunch of falsehoods. So yeah, I guess I take these things seriously, but I think there's a difference between taking things seriously and being like super overly confident in your view. So I take these things super seriously. I'm really interested in the true answers to them. But yeah, and a lot of these things are admittedly incredibly speculative, and I think you shouldn't be overly confident in very speculative stuff. So, but you should try to do the best you can to have the right credences. And
earlier you used the word physicalism, and of course it came up in the context of the philosophy of mind, and that's where the word has its home, but it also raises questions of non-physical objects, so abstract objects, then consciousness-y stuff like we've been discussing. So I do want to get to that because I know that you've done work on abstract objects and their existence or non-existence.
Yeah.
But I wonder if you think that it would be good to transition from this into a discussion of first-person realism, which I hadn't heard of this view. I don't know if you coined it.
Yeah. So it is an extremely niche minority view, but I didn't coin that phrase. I think Kit Fine used that phrase. I don't know if he got it from someone else, but people like Arthur Pryor have talked about this. Caspar Hare is a professor at MIT who wrote a whole book on this, but it's very much a minority niche view. And I should say at the beginning, when you hear the view, at least when I first heard the view, I thought the view was totally wild. How could anyone possibly believe this? And I actually still think it's probably wrong, but I just think I've recently become interested in it more just because there's so many different arguments in favor of the view, and there's so many different interesting connections to other philosophical topics. So I think the best way to get into it is actually, it's good that we went through this prelude, is continuing on the analogy of time and modality. So modality, like there's all these possible worlds. Do we think they're all on a par, or do we think one is special? Same thing with time. There's all these times. Do we think they're all on a par, or do we think one is special? We can say the same thing about different perspectives on the world. So like I have a perspective on the world, you have a perspective on the world. We all have our sort of different points of view. And I think the normal view on this is that there's nothing special about my point of view and your point of view. Like we all have our different perspectives of the world, and there's no like special metaphysical glow on me or anything like that. I think that's the standard obvious view. First-person realism denies this. It says that, at least if I put the hat on, I would say that I'm metaphysically special in a certain way. My perspective is privileged and no one else's is privileged. Sounds kind of crazy. And essentially, just as there's modal logic and temporal logic, I believe Arthur Pryor developed this sort of perspectival logic. And just like in the modal and temporal case, the actualist thinks the actual world is special, but there's still facts about what goes on in other possibilities. And in the case of time, you think the present time is special, but there's still facts about what went on at other times. And similarly, if I think my perspective is special, I think there's still facts about, from your point of view, such and such, and from other people's point of view, such and such. I just think my point of view is special if I'm the first person realist. So that's the view. And so why would anyone ever think this? It sounds totally insane. And I think maybe it is at the end of the day. But I'm just interested in it because there's so many interesting arguments in favor of it. So here's probably the argument that got me interested in it at the beginning, is that it seems like the standard arguments against physicalism about consciousness seem to generalize to first-person realism in a very straightforward way. So in the case of consciousness, there are all these alleged gaps between the physical facts and consciousness facts. And one way to bring this out is like, someone can know all the physical facts, but not know the consciousness facts. And so we have to sort of add consciousness, as a fundamental ingredient of the world. Or there are these explanatory gaps, like the physical stuff doesn't explain the consciousness stuff, therefore we have to add consciousness to the fundamental nature of the world. You can do the same thing with what you might think of as third-personal objective facts and sort of first-person perspectival facts. So it seems like someone can know all the third-personal objective facts, but not know certain first-personal facts about who they are, for example. So this comes up in cases of self-locating ignorance. So imagine you're in a room and your memory is wiped, you don't know who you are, but you also know that there's another room with a sort of clone of you in an exactly similar room. You can imagine that each person knows the entire objective theory of the world, like the position of every particle, all the third-personal facts. But there's still this sort of first-personal fact that they're ignorant of, like, who am I? Am I the one? Imagine one room is like next to a lake and one isn't. So am I this person next to the lake, or am I not? It seems like you can have complete knowledge of the sort of objective third-personal facts and not know the first-personal facts, in the very same way that you can have complete knowledge of the physical facts but not know the consciousness facts. You might think there's also like an explanatory question of like, why is it that I'm David rather than Robinson or anyone else? It seems like from a sort of God's eye point of view that just describes like the distribution of matter or whatever, it's sort of a mystery of why like I'm this one rather than anyone else. And so there's kind of an explanatory gap. There's no reason why I should have been David rather than anyone else. So there's like a prima facie analogy of just that if you think the consciousness arguments work, you should think there are these analogous first-personal arguments that work. There's also these analogies there's arguments in the metaphysics of time for the A theory that also generalize to first-person realism. So maybe we'll go through one quickly. So one argument that people use to motivate the A theory of time, or presentism in particular, is that the B theory, or it's kind of this block universe picture, doesn't seem to be able to accommodate sort of our certain attitudes we have towards time. So one famous argument is an argument by the name of, some people call it the thank goodness that's over argument. So imagine you're about to go at a doctor's appointment. It's going to be very painful. You go through it, and at the end of it, you think, thank goodness that's over. So you're very happy about something. But people thought, look, you're not happy about any like B-theoretic fact, because the B-theoretic facts are they're unchanging. You could have known all the B-theoretic facts before the doctor's appointment. You could have always known that after the doctor's appointment, you would say that you were thankful, and before the doctor's appointment, you dread it. So it seems like you're not thanking goodness for any B-theoretic fact. It seems like there's this fact about that the doctor's appointment is over, it's in the past. That's what you're thanking goodness for, and the B-theorists can't accommodate that. But there's exactly similar kinds of moves you can make for the first personal case. You could say, imagine again, you're one of these cases where you don't know who you are. So imagine you wake up in a hospital bed and there's an announcement over the intercom that says, we currently have 2 patients in the hospital. One of them is called David, one of them is called Bob. You don't know your name, you forgot your memories. And Bob is going to have an extremely excruciating surgery in 5 minutes. Okay, so you hear that announcement, 5 minutes passes, and you don't have the surgery. Like, thank goodness I'm David and not Bob. But it seems like you could have known all the third personal facts, that there's this guy David, there's this guy Bob, Bob will have the surgery, David won't. So you knew all the objective third personal facts, but there's this sort of first personal fact that you're thanking goodness for that's not captured by the third personal facts. So let me say one extra thing and then I'll stop. So a lot of people tie up this first person stuff with consciousness in a tight way. And I think they should, because I think when people talk about consciousness, there's really sort of 2 aspects of consciousness that are kind of mysterious. And people talk a lot about one, but not so much about the second. So one aspect of consciousness that's mysterious is a kind of qualitative aspect of consciousness. So like the redness of red, how do you explain the redness of red just in terms of like bare physical structure? And a lot of people think that's a really hard problem and it's hard to solve. But even if you have like these qualities in the world, like the redness of red, it seems like there's also this like subjective, first personal, perspectival character to consciousness. And it seems like even if you solve the quality problem, there's still this additional problem of this sort of point of viewishness or perspectivalness of consciousness. So even if there was like objective qualities like strewn across the physical world, it seems like you still wouldn't get points of view or perspectives on the world. And so some people have motivated this kind of first person realism as saying, yeah, there's really a kind of second hard problem over and above the qualitative character of consciousness. You need to add sort of extra fundamental facts about perspectives or points of view. And that's exactly what this kind of first person realism does. It just as like in the modal and temporal case, they think you need to describe these facts about what could have happened and these modal facts to fully describe reality. Or in the temporal case, you need to describe these temporal facts. And in the first person realism case, you need to describe these perspectival facts to account for reality. So anyway, I think the views obviously, I mean, at the end of the day, you might want to reject the view. And I think maybe that is the best thing to do at the end of the day. But I think it's interesting that there are all these parallels and all these arguments in favor of it. I guess maybe one last thing. So it's interesting to point like to point out or to interrogate why the view sounds so crazy. One reason it sounds so crazy is it has a kind of arbitrariness to it. Like why am I so special and no one else? But I actually think that sort of overgeneralizes to the time case and the modal case. So in the modal case, you can say, the modal case, people think the actual world is privileged. Like, why did it happen to be this world rather than some other world that was privileged? Is that just totally random and arbitrary? Or take the time case, why is it that the present moment is this one rather than some other one? Is that just arbitrary? So I think actually it's a lot of the objections one might have to this view kind of overgeneralized to both the temporal and modal case. It's actually not totally obvious why the view is wild, even though perhaps at the end of the day it should be rejected. It's interesting to think about.
This makes me want to go back to what we were talking about just a few minutes ago with regard to how seriously one takes the business of philosophy.
Yeah.
Because I think you have a paper that's something like 8 arguments for first-person realism.
Yeah.
And you don't believe it's the right view at this point. So what do these arguments show for you then if they don't show that the view is correct?
So for me, I just had just like in the case of time, like I'm not sure that presentism is correct, but I did have this kind of conversion experience where I thought it was obviously wrong. And I'm like, now like my credence is like shot up and now I take it way more seriously. And I wanted to like write some papers justifying why my credence has gone way up. I think a similar thing happened for first person realism. It used to be like basically credence 0. It was like, no way, this could possibly be right. But then I discovered all these interesting connections between all these other debates. And I just had this sort of conversion experience that I used to just totally dismiss the view. And now it's like shot up to, I don't know, maybe 0.1 or 0.2 or something. And I think, if there's really strong arguments for views that are not being appreciated in the wider literature and you think it should be taken more seriously by people, I think that's also worth thinking about because now the view has to be on my radar. And I think So I think just like writing about big credence shifts is worth doing, even though you might reject it at the end of the day. And another thing to say is, I think it's actually, for me, it's hard to know where all the arguments go wrong, given that, for example, if you have antecedent sympathies with the arguments from consciousness, then it's not totally clear what the disanalogy is. So I'm inclined to think, if you do think the view is wrong, then you have to say where all the arguments go wrong. And it might be that in saying where all the arguments go wrong, that gives you a deep insight into things. So I think, it's interesting. I think it's, interesting to talk about not just the view, but the arguments for the view. And in thinking about the arguments for the view, you might come to have different strong beliefs about things.
Tell me if you think that this is a worthwhile analogy to draw. There's a paper or a conjecture in the string theory literature that I think came from 1997 or 1998 on something called the EDS-CFT correspondence. And this paper has been cited something like 20,000 plus times. It's one of the most cited papers in physics, except everybody knows that it's wrong in the sense that it does not describe our universe. The idea is that it's describing a bulk, so a sort of universe like ours that's anti-de Sitter space, but ours is not anti-de Sitter space. And yet, studying this conjecture that everybody knows is wrong in the sense that it doesn't map onto our world, it still led to tremendous advances in string or M theory, black hole thermodynamics, thinking about the emergence of space and time, but everybody still knows it's wrong. So I'm wondering if, in this case, you still find that even if you don't end up believing the first-person realism view, going through this exercise of developing all these arguments still might point you in the way of something that is correct.
I totally agree with that. Yeah, I think a lot of interesting stuff happens by being clear of why something's wrong and where certain arguments go wrong. So even like, suppose you're a determined physicalist about consciousness, you think consciousness just reduces to stuff out the brain. I think it might be worth looking at sort of anti-physicalist arguments because it might inform like what version of physicalism you have. You know, there's different versions that respond to the arguments in different ways. And yeah, I think that might inform your views in different ways. So yeah, I think it's very valuable sometimes to, I mean, of course, it's sometimes true that they're just wacky views that don't have anything interesting to say about them. And obviously you shouldn't spend your time doing that. But when there's wacky views that seem to have prima facie compelling arguments, I think that's a very interesting sort of situation because you don't want to endorse the arguments, but the arguments aren't like obviously terrible at first glance, and so something has to shift. Yeah.
Well, the last thing that I wanted to make sure that we touched on today is your work in the philosophy of math. And at the beginning of our conversation, you said that well before philosophy, you thought you might be a logician.
No.
Where then did the philosophy of math enter the picture?
Yeah. I guess it entered the picture probably because I had this antecedent interest in math, and then I had this antecedent interest in philosophy, and then it's just cool that there's this intersection. But besides that, I just think the actual substance of the questions in philosophy of math are just very interesting. And I guess there's sort of two big questions in the philosophy of math that really motivate me. One is just a kind of question in metaphysics, ontology of like, is there some sort of reality to sort of abstract Platonic objects? Does like the universe divide into like the concrete realm and the Platonic realm? Yes or no? I think that's a big divide in metaphysics. But also within the philosophy of mathematics, I like this question of like sort of to what extent are there sort of objective answers to questions that sort of aren't decidable by the kind of axioms that we have, like the continuum hypothesis and this kind of stuff. And I think you might initially think that these two questions are very correlated. You might think if you're a kind of Platonist, you might think that there are objective answers to all these kinds of questions, but I actually think, that move is pretty suspect. So I actually think pretty much you can have any of the four possible positions. You can be a Platonist, nominalist, or an objectivist or pluralist about these questions. And so I think both questions are really interesting on their own merits. And I think they actually have a lot of downstream consequences, actually in metaphysics and physics. So, I mean, maybe we'll get to it, but I had this pretty also kind of wacky paper where I try to argue that there's only one size of infinity. Everything has to be countable. And I think that sounds pretty weird, but I think if that view is true, it has actually a lot of implications outside of the philosophy of math to how we do physics and various metaphysical puzzles. So I think, yeah, there's a lot of connections.
Okay, very interesting. Yeah, what I wanted to ask before we get into the sort of meat of your work is if there is a foundational position in the philosophy of math that you find most promising, or if you want to put your credence in most of your credence in that one.
I guess I'm very tempted towards a kind of nominalistic view where there are no abstract Platonic objects. There's only concretely existing stuff. So then there's a natural question of like how you understand math in that kind of way. And I think there's multiple different ways of going here, and I'm sort of neutral on different kinds of ways. There's kind of there's a view of modal structuralism, I think that Jeffrey Hellman has, that I think is one way to capture like some kind of objectivity to mathematical assertions, even though there are no like Platonic abstract mathematical objects, which is basically that math is the study of possible structures. So when someone says something like there are infinitely many prime numbers or something, that's basically saying necessarily for any things that instantiate the sort of natural number structure, there's going to be infinitely many of those things that are prime numbers where that's cashed out in a way that doesn't mention numbers. There's other sort of fictionalist views which say sort of, if there were mathematical objects, this is how they would be, or some kind of other kind of way that capture the content, the sort of objective content. Because even if you think mathematical assertions are like strictly speaking false because there's no mathematical objects, you should still say there's some sort of important difference between 2 plus 2 equals 4 and 2 plus 2 equals 5, and I just think there's several ways of going there. So yeah, but anyway, I guess a broadly nominalist, maybe kind of fictionalist kind of view.
The structuralist program grew out of another Princeton philosopher, Paul Benacerraf. I think his paper was entitled What Numbers Cannot Be.
Yeah.
And you have a paper titled Why There Can't Be Numbers. And so what is the gist of that argument that you make there?
Yeah, so I guess this is one, I basically have like two main papers arguing for nominalism, and this is one of them. So basically, if there are these abstract Platonic things, I'm just like really curious about what they're actually like. So I want to know more about these abstract entities. And sadly, like, we don't really know much about them in the sense that abstract objects are often defined in a negative way. So like, an abstract object is something that's non-physical, non-spatiotemporal, non-causal, non-mental, etc. So we have all these negative characterizations, but I just want to know is there anything positive to say about the nature of these objects? So you might look at mathematical practice, like does math tell us what the number 2 actually is like? And yes, so I think ultimately when you look at math actually doesn't tell you anything about what the number 2 is like. It tells you all of these relational facts, these sort of structural facts. So like the number 2 comes after the number 1, it comes before the number 3. And even these properties like being even or odd are actually ultimately cashed out in terms of a bunch of relations. So like to say that the number 10 is even, it's just to say that like there's this other number 2 that bears this divisor of relation to 10. And I think ultimately when you get down to it, everything in math is this purely relational thing. And you can see that via the fact that mathematicians only care about things up to isomorphism. So they care about the relations that things stand in, but you could put in whatever you want for the actual members. They only care about things up to isomorphism. So I think like the number 2 doesn't have any kind of properties that we ordinarily encounter. It's not physical, spatial, mental, causal, whatever. And math doesn't tell you anything about the intrinsic properties of number 2 either. It just comes after 1, comes before 3, it's prime, but that's analyzed in terms of relations. So I was thinking, like, is there anything at all to say about what the number 2 is like? And in the metaphysical literature, people sometimes talk about these things called bare particulars. And bare particulars are these like hypothetical things that have no intrinsic properties at all. So no color, shape, size, smell, nothing. So they're things, they're particulars, but they're bare in the sense that they don't have any intrinsic properties at all, or at least no sort of positive. They have a bunch of negative things, like they're non-massive, non-colored, non-shaped, but they don't have any kind of positive character. And a lot of people throughout history, like since the ancient Greeks or whatever, have been very mystified by this notion of a bare particular, like something that genuinely exists, but it has like, it's like nothing at all. And when I try to like conceive of a bare particular, like in my mind, I have this sort of idea of like a gray pearl or something, but obviously it's neither gray nor a pearl. So I find it like difficult to even conceive of a bare particular. And I think there's certain independently motivated metaphysical views that are just incompatible with the existence of bare particulars. So, I mean, this gets into the weeds, but, you know, metaphysicians think a lot about the relationship between an object and the properties that it has. And there's a traditional metaphysical view where they're just like two separate categories. There's the objects and the properties, and the objects have the properties. But there's another metaphysical view known as like the bundle theory where like there isn't like a thing that has the properties. Really, there's just like a bundle of properties, and that's all there is to objects. And the bundle theory is just incompatible with the existence of bare particulars. So the idea of a bare particular is like if you strip away all the properties, there's like something left, a kind of bare pearl or something. But there's certain metaphysical views where no, there isn't this like thing left after you get rid of all the properties. So anyway, so I guess the argument in the paper that I try to defend is something like if there were abstract mathematical objects, they would be bare particulars. But there's independent reason to be skeptical of the existence of bare particulars. Therefore, there's independent reason to be skeptical of the existence of abstract mathematical objects. I defend the view that mathematical objects, if they exist, would be bare particulars by this kind of structuralist view that all mathematics tells us about these things are purely relational. And I defend there are no bare particulars view. I mean, first I just have a very strong metaphysical intuition that there's something very spooky and coherent about bare particulars, that things have to have a certain kind of positive character to them. But also there are independently motivated metaphysical views that are incompatible with them. So anyway, that's what I try to defend in that paper.
The way that you started off, or maybe this isn't how you started off, but it seems like something akin to Ben Osraff's argument pushes you away from this idea of numbers as objects to numbers as structures. And then within structuralism, there are two broad camps and the finer grained distinctions between eliminative and non-eliminative structuralists. The eliminative structuralists think that you can get rid of the abstract objects. So you find yourself in this category because primarily there's no good positive argument for the existence of the abstract objects.
Or there's no good account of what they would be like.
Yes.
So that's one reason. I mean, I think I have this other paper that I think I also like, but that's one reason I'm inclined towards them. I think we don't have any positive account of what they would be like, and we have independent reason to think there has to be some positive account of what they're like.
Have you read this paper? I only saw it in an anthology, a paper by somebody named N.P. White.
I don't think so.
Oh, it's an interesting paper. He's actually, I don't know if he's still alive, but he was a Plato scholar, but early in his career, he wrote one paper on the philosophy of math, and it is building off of Ben Osraff's paper, and he takes a Pythagorean stance and argues that there are different number structures all around us. And
sure. I'm fine with thinking that there might be concrete entities that realize structure. So imagine there's a row of dominoes that's never ending. Then you could just label the first one as 1, the next one as 2. And then there's this successor of relation that's like, you can think of as the 2 centimeters away from relation. And then you can think of our natural number talk as just talk with the dominoes and like, there's infinitely many dominoes, there's this domino has this relation to these other dominoes. So I'm fine with there being lots of physical things that instantiate certain mathematical structures. And I think that's really the explanation for why math is useful in physics, that there are certain physical structures that are sort of concrete instantiations of certain mathematical patterns. So I'm happy with that. Yeah.
Then how does this view in the philosophy of mathematics that there are no abstract objects, everything is concrete, and maybe this is putting a word into your mouth, physical. How does this square though with your idealistic?
Yeah. So I guess I just say everything is concrete, and then there's actually the word physical is kind of a mess. I mean, some like panpsychists want to say they're physicalists and things. So anyway, so I guess I would just want to say everything is concrete, where concrete is something like, I don't know, engages in causal relations to other things, and there are paradigm examples all around us and this kind of stuff. There's nothing that's non-spatial-temporal, non-causal, non-mental, all this kind of stuff. So there's none of that stuff. This is how I define it.
This has been so fun. I've really been looking forward to talking to you for a long time. I'm
Thanks
really
for
glad we
me.
got this really nice place at NYU to do it. So thanks again so much for the conversation.
Thanks again for inviting me. I really enjoyed it.